Rome had seen 1,000 hypocrisies, but none so perfectly costumed as the boy who wore the triple crown. It was May of 964, and the Eternal City was sweating in the grip of an early summer, the kind that turned the Tiber sluggish and thick as old bile, that drove rats from the sewers and drove men to their basest desires. The Lateran Palace blazed with torchlight by 10 in the evening. From the Caelian hill, a traveler might have mistaken it for a victory celebration. Banners of gold and crimson hung limp in the still air. The smell of roasted fowl and burned tallow drifted as far as the old forum, mingling with the summer rot of a city that had been rotting beautifully for 1,000 years. Servants moved through corridors of marble in practiced silence, their sandals whispering against stone that had witnessed empires rise, corrupt themselves, and fall to dust. His name, his real name, the one his mother had given him, was Octavian. But God, or rather the ambitions of powerful men, had stolen that name away and replaced it with John. He was 26 years old. He had been pope since the age of 18, elected not by the grace of heaven, but by the scheming of his father, Alberic II, Prince of Rome, who had extracted a deathbed oath from the Roman nobility that his bastard son would one day sit in Peter's chair. The Church complied. The Church always complied in the end. That was the secret no cardinal ever said aloud, but every cardinal understood. He was handsome in the manner of men who have never once been told they are not. Thick, dark hair, slightly oiled, eyes the color of overripe olives, clever, restless, perpetually amused by some private calculation. His papal vestments, when he bothered to wear them, were the finest Byzantine silk, heavy with gold thread, crusted at the hem with Alexandrian pearls. Tonight, he only wore a loose linen tunic, knotted carelessly at the chest, and he held a bronze cup of Falernian wine as though it were a scepter. He sat at the far end of the great hall, in a chair that was not quite a throne, but had been arranged to suggest one, because everything in John XII's life was arranged to suggest something grander than the truth. This was the man the Church called Vicar of Christ. This was the man who had turned the Lateran Palace, the holiest residence in Christendom, into something that Liutprand of Cremona, that meticulous and gleeful chronicler of scandals, would describe without flinching as a brothel. He had ordained men in stables. He had blinded his own confessor. He had called upon the devil for assistance at dice. He had committed acts in the very tomb of St. Peter that made even hardened Roman cynics avert their eyes. The charges against him, read aloud at a later synod, ran to 10 counts: adultery, sacrilege, violence, simony, and things the scribes recorded in Latin so as to keep the worst of it from the merely literate. All of this was known, all of this was tolerated, in the way that power always finds its tolerance for power, until the night power made its single irreversible mistake. Her name was Stefania. She was the wife of a soldier named Gerardo, a man of middling property and considerable pride, which is perhaps the most combustible combination the devil ever assembled. She had been brought to the Lateran months earlier as a household attendant, a function that was, in the understanding of those who arranged such things, largely ornamental. She was beautiful in a dark, precise way, cheekbones like blades, a mouth that seemed always on the verge of saying something she had decided at the very last moment to withhold. The Pope noticed her precisely because she did not seem to notice him. In his experience, and his experience was extensive, women in the proximity of the papal throne fell into two categories: those who feared him and those those who desired his patronage. Stefania appeared to belong to neither. She moved through the corridors of the Lateran as though walking through a market she had no intention of buying from. This, to John XII, was an intolerable condition. He began his pursuit the way he began all his pursuits, with gifts she had not requested, attention she had not invited, and the slow, grinding application of pressure that powerful men have always mistaken for seduction. He found her one afternoon in the antechamber and said with the confidence of a man who has never heard a final no in his life, "You do not smile when I enter a room. Every other creature in Rome smiles when I enter a room, especially the ones planning to betray me. Yet you stand there with that particular expression, as if you are remembering something more interesting than me." She kept her eyes on the floor. She said, "Your Holiness mistakes my reverence for distance. I stand silent before the Vicar of Christ because I believe in the weight of the office. I would not insult it with idle smiling." What she meant, what he understood perfectly well that she meant, was, "I know exactly what you are, and I am afraid because I understand." He laughed. He always laughed when a woman outmaneuvered him in words. It was how he disguised the fact that he had filed the exchange away like an unpaid debt to be collected later at his own convenience. 3 weeks before that May night, Gerardo received a summons, a military errand, the suppression of a cattle dispute in the hills south of Tivoli, the sort of thing that required a week, perhaps 2. He kissed Stefania goodbye at the city gate just after dawn. He was a large man, broad through the chest, with calloused hands and an honest face. He smelled of horses and iron shavings. Before he turned his horse south, he paused and said, "I don't like you being in that palace without me." She told him, "I am in the service of the Pope's own household. God himself is my protection." He was quiet for a moment, adjusting his belt belt. Then he said, "Yes, that is what concerns me." He rode south. The summons, as it turned out, had been a fabrication. The official he was meant to meet in Tivoli stared at him from the doorway of a farmhouse surrounded by no dispute whatsoever, and regarded him with polite, total bewilderment. There was no cattle dispute. There had never been a cattle dispute. There was only the open countryside, the summer heat, and the slowly clarifying understanding of what the summons actually had been. Gerardo turned his horse back to Rome at a pace that began methodical and accelerated through the hours into something that his horse, sensing the weight of the silence on its back, chose not to contest. He rode through the Porta Asinaria at dusk, past vendors dismantling their stalls, past monks returning to their houses, past beggars who did not bother to extend their hands at a man with that particular set to his jaw. He stabled his horse himself, in the habit of men who trust no one with what they value. And then he walked, not ran, never ran. A soldier does not run through a city that is watching. He walked to the Lateran palace. The guard at the north postern knew him by sight. The guard was young and possessed, perhaps unfortunately for everyone involved, a conscience that had not yet fully calcified. He looked at the broad-shouldered soldier standing in the lamplight with a face like a closed fist, and he looked at the garden door 15 paces away, and he made the calculation that has ended more careers and more lives than any sword. He stepped aside. The garden door, the antechamber, 3 steps across cool tile, the inner door that had not been bolted. A soldier's eyes adjust to darkness the way a scholar's eyes adjust to fine print, through discipline, through long practice. Gerardo did not need light to take a full accounting of the room. The silk panels on the walls, imperial purple. The great carved cedar bed, its posts shaped like ascending saints with expressions of considerable discomfort. The burned-down candles, the smell of wax and a woman's perfume, and the particular unmistakable warmth of a room that had been occupied. He stood in the doorway for a duration that was either very short or very long, and what he experienced in that interval was not exactly anger. Anger was familiar territory. Anger was a country he knew, but something colder and more architectural. The recognition that the world was precisely as he had feared it was, and that knowing this would not make him feel better, and that he knew this since the moment the farmhouse door opened. John XII woke to the displacement of air that centuries of warfare had taught a soldier's body to register even through silk and Falernian wine. His eyes opened. He saw, in the guttering light of one remaining candle, the face of a man who had been sent away for nothing. He saw his own death standing in his bedroom in riding clothes. His first thought, and it shamed him even then, even at that final moment, was not contrition, it was strategy. Who had told him? Could the guard be silenced before dawn? Was there some arrangement of words, some position of power that could be made to fit this configuration of people in this room? His second thought arrived with the blow. What exactly happened in that chamber has been debated by chroniclers for 1,000 years. Some say a hammer, some say a sword. Liutprand of Cremona wrote that the stroke was delivered with such force that it shattered the Pope's skull, and that the Holy Father was dead before the last candle burned out entirely. Others, those more invested in protecting the institution than in telling the truth, would later claim John XII died peacefully in his sleep of a stroke, in the manner of a very old man, which is what powerful institutions have always done with their monsters, furnished them with clean deaths they did not earn. Dawn came to Rome the next morning as it always had, indifferent, punctual, gold over the eastern hills, while the western sky still held its dark. The Basilica of St. John at the Lateran sounded matins with the same bronze voice it had used for every morning of the past century. The chambermaids who entered the papal apartments at Prime found the cedar bed cold. They found the silk panels stirring in the draught of a garden door left open. They found the stub of one burned-out candle. They found the carved saints with their expressions of distress, which in the thin morning light seemed less like artistic convention and more like testimony. Word was sent to the College of Cardinals. A new successor would need to be elected. The people did not need the details. The people, it was decided, never needed the details. A story was assembled, natural causes, a stroke, the will of God, and distributed with the efficiency of an institution that has long practice in deciding what the faithful can and cannot bear to know. Gerardo was never formally accused of anything. He left Rome within the week. History does not follow him. History, in its merciful or its cowardly way, declines to pursue the man who did what history itself could not. Stefania's fate is likewise unrecorded, which is its own form of violence. She had been a footnote in someone else's story, and she would remain one. The city of Rome, of course, knew. Cities always know. The story spread from the Lateran district outward like wine spilled on white cloth, quick, thorough, unstoppable. By midday it had reached the Campo Marzio. By vespers it had reached the Trastevere. By the following morning, the taverns near the Tiber Island were doing considerable trade in a particular variety of dark joke, the kind that laughs loudest because it cannot afford to reckon with what it is actually saying. That power corrupts the holy as readily as the profane. That a triple crown protects a man from everything except the things he deserves. that God, whatever arrangements he had made or declined to make regarding the eternal city, occasionally works through the most unexpected instruments. Octavian, who was also John, who was also the vicar of Christ, who was also a boy given a throne before he understood the weight of it, was buried with the full rites of the church. Candles were lit, prayers were said. The words were spoken in Latin, as they always were, in voices trained since boyhood not to waver. The college convened, a new name was chosen, a new man sat in the chair, and Rome continued, as Rome has always continued, through its saints and despite its monsters, through every corruption and every reckoning, through every morning that arrives indifferent and on schedule, gold over the eastern hills, while the city beneath it goes on forgetting what it cannot afford to remember. Pope John XII died May 14, 964 AD. He had served as pope since the age of 18. He was approximately 26 years old. He remains, by nearly every historical account, the worst pope who ever lived, and the only one whose story ends not with divine judgment, but with a soldier's quiet footsteps on cobblestone and a garden door that was never bolted.